There we go. You probably just got a warning that I'm recording you. Dan, yeah, great question. So there's a chapter in the book where I talk about my experiences in China a little bit. I spent a lot of time in China. My first book, Double Happiness, was about my experiences in China. And I don't spend a lot of time in the book on China, but there is a point there where my time in China, especially the third time I was there, played a big role in sort of my opening my eyes about media. And so I was in China. I witnessed propaganda in China, particularly around this incident when there was a spy plane, a US spy plane, flying over China, over Hainan Island, which is off the southeast coast of China. And it went down. It was this big kerfuffle. Had it been shot down? Had it just crashed? Was it pilot error? And so I was able to actually notice for the first time, I really noticed that in the American media, the internet was a thing. This is like the early 2000s, but I could go into, and the internet was not yet really censored in China. So I just went into an internet cafe and I was sort of reading CNN.com about this, and I'm in China at the time, about this spy plane. And then meanwhile, I can go out to the Chinese newsstand and buy a newspaper and sort of with my dictionary piece the articles together. And it was a completely different story. I mean, in the Chinese newspapers, it was this just outrageous, unbelievable thing that the United States could just fly their spy planes right over China and sort of do what they want. Whereas in the American media, it was this, who does China think they are? They can just shoot down our spy planes. We're just, we're just checking things out over the ocean. We're not really like into any nefarious business over mainland China. So yeah, it has been really interesting to watch this kerfuffle unfold with the balloon, the big balloon that, I guess they shot it down, that the Biden administration now is saying they shot it down, although people will say, well, they shot it down after it got to sort of float across the entire continental United States. So it seems like, well, why wouldn't they have shot it down earlier? I guess what I would say is, that experience in China for me was one of my first awakening experience to see that the American media is not, up until that point, I kind of had this idea that the Chinese media is heavily distorted, heavily propaganda, all deception. The American media is free, and people make mistakes, but it's always they're trying to basically report the truth as they see it. And that was a moment when I noticed, no, the United States media, now the Chinese media was certainly very biased as well, absolutely. And the propaganda was fairly thick. But on the American side, it was as well. They weren't telling the whole story, and they weren't really addressing the Chinese side and the objections that China was bringing up. I think in retrospect, looking back, and I talk about this in the book a little bit, it was kind of in between the two stories, what really happened. I think, it's even hard to know now, but it seems like that spy plane, there was a Chinese pilot on the other side that was kind of a hot shot and flew really close to the American plane. And that caused the American plane to maybe what the Chinese pilot wanted, what the Chinese Air Force wanted was to kind of throw the American plane off course. But then at that point, the American pilot made an error and ended up crashing. I think that's what happened. So it's an interesting incident. I think with the balloon story, I think we're not getting the whole story. I don't think we know. I don't think we can feel certain what the purpose of the balloon is. China says it's just and people that are much concerned about sort of Chinese designs on the future think that it was something more nefarious. Did you have something you wanted to share about that, Dan?
I just wanted to see if you had a take on it that was different.
Yeah, my sense is most likely the Chinese balloon was doing some type of reconnaissance, and that the Chinese saying that it just sort of floated off course. But I don't know. I haven't done enough research to say that with certainty. We all need to balance our media diet. I need to read a little bit more about it to feel certain about that.
Yeah, and Nick Lento here, and I think it's pretty probable that there's going to be hearings in the next few months, if not sooner, where whatever details can be leaked or come out, especially if they're embarrassing to the administration, will be coming out. My ironic sense of it is if the Chinese were clever enough to actually launch a real weather balloon, anticipating this kind of kerfuffle, as you put it, and then it turns out that that is what the debris ends up being, that would be a propaganda coup for them. I doubt that. I mean, that's just a kind of almost like a gamey way to play it. But my take on it is as two things. One, how could it be that we weren't aware of it until it was over Montana? I mean, that's kind of scary. Number two, the best way to take it down, I agree with waiting till it was over the water, and they were jamming it. It wasn't relaying any information. It was being jammed all the way. But when it got to be like maybe 10 miles approaching the ocean, they could have used, instead of a missile, this big destructive explosive thing, they could have just used a projectile. These fighter jets can fire bullets. All it would have taken was, maybe 10 rounds at the tippy top of the balloon. The escaping gas under pressure would have driven the balloon down relatively slowly, and it would have fallen almost in one piece in shallow water. And to me, I mean, I'm no expert on aerodynamics or intelligence gathering. Well, somebody in the Pentagon thought of that.
So my first question, and I think it's part of tonight, is celebrating media consciousness. Tell us where you read about it. What sources have you looked at? Has it been a broad diversity or just one or two? I'm curious, Nick.
2 or 3 sources on the first day or two that this happened. Then I put up a post on Facebook within a day of, speculating just for the heck of it about the potential national security interests. Like if the Chinese really wanted to do us harm, they could have engineered some kind of a virus and then distributed it over the air and, really messed us up. And it really annoyed me that 2 days later, I saw that speculation on Fox News, which I also watch occasionally to know what their, what kind of nefarious takes they have on things. And I just think that,
So which sources was it that were the ones that you placed your trust in, and which were the ones that you were more suspicious of? That's what I'm curious.
I think all the stories that I read were pretty much the same. USA Today, CNN, it was the same, mainstream press. Now, from the left wing, I did read in the last couple of days from the left wing media, and I forget the names of the sources, but their take is that we should have left it alone. It was very aggressive of us to destroy it, and how dare we? And this is just American imperialistic aggression, blah, blah, blah. So, and as far as the commercial media, I don't think that their censorship is as overt or directly controlled by the government as it is in China. I think it's self-censorship because it's all commercial. So they're beholden to corporations. Like there's no equivalence between MSNBC and Fox. Not really. Anyway, I'll shut up there.
Well, those are great questions, and you have some assumptions in there that we'll get into that I think are worth considering, and that I wrote the book partly to uncover and to sort of pull apart. So yeah, thanks so much. Anybody else? Free question. I wanted to see. I think Kevin Cristaldi's on the call, and I wanted to just give a little thanks to Kevin because a couple of you suggested this idea, but it was Kevin's idea that was like, how come you haven't done the online book release yet? And so so thank you, Kevin, for insisting on that. I really appreciate that. But anybody else that wants to throw in a question or even to question each other?
Tony, thank you. Quick request, like, is it possible we could see the gallery view until you get started so we can see each other?
Oh yeah, feel free to ask them. I am not a Zoom master, so let's see, how do I do that? I go up here.
I think you just have to stop. Yeah.
Oh, stop sharing.
There you go.
Oh, nice. Well, hey, thanks so much for that, Kevin. I'll take this moment to, since we can all see each other now, I do have a little wine here, and you're welcome to have a drink if you'd like. I just wanted to offer a toast to everyone who's here, everyone that played a role in bringing this book into existence. So many of you played a role. I'm going to be calling out people and reading the acknowledgements here in a minute, but so I'm not going to call out names specifically right now, but you know what role you played, and I really appreciate it. So here's to all of you. Thank you. Cheers. All right, well, a few more minutes with everybody, nobody on mute, so feel free to ask any questions or say anything you'd like. Also, if my video ever gets crunchy, I can switch onto the wired connection. I might do that. I'm on Wi-Fi still, but just let me know. I'm also going to switch to this better mic here, I think, when I do the readings.
Yeah, I was just going to say before we get to the official part, congratulations.
Damian, thanks so much, man. And now I'm on this mic, so thank you, Damian. It's awesome to see you, by the way. Thanks so much for joining. Yeah, it's been a long one. It's been 3 years, 3.5 years, just about with this one. So, oh hey, I can turn on my little light up. Let's see how this looks.
Okay. How far have we read here? Ender. Very fancy.
Tony, it's
What's
your
our
new
favorite?
neighbor.
Yeah.
Tony, it's your new neighbor, Steve Rohde.
Hey, Steve.
My question's directed to the mermaid of Atlantis. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that you're having more time with Tony now?
Steve, how did you read my mind and my heart? It's a great thing. You know, 3.5 years is a long time to be partnered with someone very singular focused, but I have to say, you know, Tony has really put the time in to do the research and has been very committed. And things shifted right there, right in mid-December. I don't know what happened. It's like all of a sudden I had my fun, playful husband back. So we've been having a great time. And I say that in the sense of, you know, it takes a lot of rigor to do the discipline of writing every day. And so I kind of witnessed it on the sidelines, but it's really nice to have him back. So for any of you on this Zoom that have missed Tony in the last couple years or so, I promise he's still there. And he's still a lot of fun. Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Thanks so much, Steve. Yeah.
Going to have questions afterwards, or do you want us to ask them now?
No, we're going to definitely have questions afterwards. This is just sort of the informal warm up, me to figure out what I haven't gotten done right with the Zoom and stuff like that. Have a first sip of wine. So yeah, whatever. It's pretty informal right now.
I'm proud.
You have people from all over the world here.
That would be fun. So here's a good little icebreaker. You know, I put in the chat a whole bunch of links like where to get the book. So if you have any questions about that, a couple of different options on where to get the book, also how to get a free excerpt, and how to sign up for my newsletter and my video thing. It'd be fun if everybody just wrote in there in the chat where you're calling in from. If you're, you know, I'll start. I'm in Sebastopol, California. Cheers, Michael Mendoza. Ooh, Hanoi, that's the furthest so far. Oh, it's gonna be tough to beat Hanoi. Gainesville, San Francisco. Western North Carolina. Hey, that's not too far from Asheville. Eugene.
Let's go back up and see if you can get Bob Michelson.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I just wanted to say I'm proud to say I got the very first copy of this book. What did you call it? The
I don't see anything.
copy?
Advanced review copy.
Advanced review copy. Yeah, I just showed up at Tony's house when the box of the first books came, and I got the first copy. So I hold that very dear. Someday it'll be worth millions, maybe.
It's true. I was so nervous to let it go. It was the first book I let go. I think it was even Pamela who was like, "Why don't you give him one?" I was like, "Oh, okay. Can I let it go?" Yeah, that first box of books was special. But yeah, I was honored to give it to you, brother.
I'm very honored to receive it, of course.
There it is. Yeah. Yeah, and obviously if you don't have your copy yet, I put a bunch of links there in the chat at the top on how to get your copy.
Is there any difference in we got a copy from Amazon that is not the newest copy. It was before it came out. Are there any differences?
Yes, so that's a good point. I'll just spend 1 minute on that before we hit 6. There was a little bit of a production snafu where there's a little bit of production snafu where some of Amazon for some reason got a number of books in stock before we had signed off at BookBaby at the publisher. So if your book says copyright 2022 instead of 2023, then you have the collector's edition that doesn't have there were very small edits, but there was an additional round of editing that went on just at the very, very end with a few things. So you can go ahead and get your 2023 copy as well, or you can read enjoy the 2022 version. You also can tell because the cover is slightly different. The 2022 one, the blue is a little bit darker. I don't know if you can see it.
I don't know which one. This is from
I have one of
Amazon.
each right here. I don't know. I notice it. I notice these things, but you might not notice.
Now I'm a little concerned because
23.
I tried to save money and I got the Kindle off of Amazon to save a few bucks. My budget is limited. Now, will the Kindle be updated with the latest?
Kindle
edits?
is updated.
You know?
Yeah, the ebook.
There's 102.
The ebook wasn't released. It was released last. The ebook was released sort of towards the end of January, and so it's the latest. Yeah, the only one is if you bought a book, if you pre-ordered it on Amazon in December, which is what I was encouraging people to do, so it's a little bit my fault. You probably got a 2022 version. And if it makes you unhappy, then just send me an email and I'll send you a 2023 for complimentary because it was a little bit of a fault on our end.
I think
It's
Pam
very, very similar, but there's a few changes.
Pam,
Tony, I got a quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
I've got a quick question. I'm not too far into the book, but the introduction, you start off with this pretty dramatic quote from William Casey, CIA.
Yeah.
And I looked into the back where you've got the notes on any of the chapters and stuff like that.
Yep.
And there was there's no saying where that quote is from. There's no footnote to that quote, and there's no reference to it in the back. Where that quote's from. It just says 1981 to 87.
Yeah, so I'll answer that in just one quick minute, and then we can get into questions at the end of the readings. So the book is heavily, I'll say a general thing and then specific thing about that quote. So the book is very heavily footnoted, as it had to be, because this book, it's a book about truth. It's a book trying to get to the bottom of things. And so there's 50 pages of footnotes at the end. We decided to move them to the end so that they didn't disrupt the flow of the book. But yeah, there's still, I could have spent another 12 months just footnoting every single sentence of the book, and I didn't. There are some places where I would have liked to have added some more footnotes. But we cut it off at sort of, how many we'd had. So there are a few places there. but in every single instance, I've really attempted to ensure that the what I'm saying is backed up and is 100% true to the best of my knowledge. So with that specific quote, so I did a bit of research into that specific quote, and you can find at first it was quoted, and somebody came out and said, no, this doesn't appear to be valid. We don't think this person said it. But then a couple years later, two different women who were in the meeting when the CIA director said it provided quotes saying, yes, I remember, I was there when he said it. Basically, he said it was in the early 80s, and he was talking about a specific campaign in the CIA, a specific, I think it was, it's not Iran-Contra because it's earlier than that. It was a scandal that was taking place in the early 80s, and it does escape me right now. I'll have to find it. But basically, he said, we need to make sure people don't know about this. And so he said, our campaign will be complete when everything the American public believes is false. I'll get the specific quote for you later, and I should have put it in the book. You're right, absolutely, that should be in there.
Yeah, because it's a fairly dramatic quote. I mean, it kind of slaps you right in the face. We'll be successful when everything the American people believe is false.
Yeah,
and it doesn't say about a particular thing. It just says everything that the Americans believe, like, that the sky is blue. As soon as they start believing the sky is red, then we'll know we've got them.
Yeah, and I did pull the quote to make it dramatic, because there is in the quote above it, he is talking about a specific campaign. But I agree, it's an important quote, and it does kind of hit you in the face. And I use it in the first video as well, in the first video that I released, because it is a powerful quote. All right, well, we're gonna get started now in the little formal part of the evening in terms of the formal book release. So I am gonna put everyone on mute. There will be lots of time for questions when we get to after the readings. Basically, how we're gonna do this is I'm gonna do several readings, and then we'll have a little bit of questions between two of the readings, and then we'll do a lot of questions and stuff like that at the end. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to switch off of my Wi-Fi onto a cabled connection. So if for some reason the Zoom drops, just please join right back. I just think the connection will be a little clearer. So I'm going to do that right now.
I think temporarily.
So that's done. Everyone should be on mute. I'll just make sure. Okay. All right. I have lost the video. All right, I'm going to share this page. This is the book release little poster I made. But I'm going to start with a little grounding time where we just all get really present. I spent a lot of time by myself writing this book. I am very thankful to my family, and particularly my wife, for allowing me to do this. I spent a lot of time quietly alone researching on this book, and I know we're all sort of in our own world on Zoom right now. And I wanted to just take a moment first of silence, where we just sort of come into this space. And so feel where you are right now. You are probably seated on something hard or something firm, or maybe your feet are on the ground. Feel your presence. Below you is a floor. Below that floor, there's a ground. There's an earth below us. And above you, there's probably a ceiling. And above that, a roof. And above that, the sky, probably the stars if it's nighttime. And now that we're all here, I'd like to fill this space with gratitude. Gratitude to all of you for being here, for taking time from your busy schedule, your busy lives, to think about something that maybe we don't always think about, but to bring consciousness to something that I believe is worthwhile. So the first reading I'm going to do is the acknowledgements of the book. And this is the last, as they say, the last shall be first. So this is the final, right before the footnotes, the final page of the book. And I want to thank the people that helped me get to this point. Acknowledgements. It's a delightful task to recall the people who helped me write, edit, and publish this book. May those whose names I've accidentally left out forgive me. First, without the editing, coaching, and assistance of Maria Lewitzki-Milligan, this book would likely still be in its first draft. Thank you, Maria, from the bottom of my heart, for all of your amazing work throughout writing, revising, sourcing, footnoting, and revising again. Jessica Kleinman was ridiculously patient with me, and her creative instincts and facility with typesetting give this book's text its flow and beauty. Jason Anscombe did an amazing job with the cover and was unflinchingly flexible with his time as we iterated through designs and titles. My profound thanks to the alpha readers who read the manuscript first. They encouraged me where the book was going in the right direction and warned me where it was heading off into the wilderness. Dan Burfoot, Brian Fair, Michael Badar, and Lynne Michelson, thank you. Later in 2022, the beta readers provided invaluable insights and suggestions. Ken Burrows, Vicky Estrella, Ruben Sandler, Kalita Malouf, and Andrew Thomas. Thank you. I would like to thank my sister, Wendy Heilbutt, now in her own legal practice, for registering the key trademarks and providing early lawyerly thoughts. My new neighbor, Steve Rohde, moved in up the hill just in time to provide me with other valuable lawyerly thoughts, as well as insights into our dear, lasting treasure, the First Amendment. I would like to stop the presses and the moving vans to thank the brilliant Ashley Rindsberg, who found time during an international move to pen a compelling foreword, which we will hear tonight. Please rush out and find The Gray Lady Winked, wherever fine books are sold. You will be enthralled, horrified, and enlightened. Peggy Duffield, you might know me better than I know myself. Your coaching these last 10 years has unlocked potential I didn't know I had. Can you believe we're here now, writing and reading an acknowledgements page for a book that not long ago was just an idea, a fantasy, a figment of our imaginations? Zach Vieira, thank you for being so many things: a friend, a fellow rower, a tenant, a burner, a musician, and the designer of the logos and early design ideas that led to this cover. Nick Boulay, your video editing for the Red, White, and Blind channel has taken another fantasy of mine into reality. I would like to thank Dalen Miller and Jimmy Dwyer at DMPG for their unstinting publicity work and for placing me on podcasts where I get to live out my dream of talking to people about these issues so near to my heart. My sweet gratitude to the excellent folks in Sebastopol at Hippie Pizzazz and Hot Monk, eateries that I haunted for days while revising the manuscript. To everyone who has commented on my blog and on social media, thank you. Many of you, Scott Benjur, Kevin Cristaldi, Jim Brasunas, Rachel Altman, Bjorn Remmers, Loree Sandler, Ann Buzzard, and many more provided important advice when I was selecting the cover, author photos, and subtitle. Finally, and most deeply of all, I would like to thank my beautiful wife, Pamela Brasunas, for caring for our amazing Corin and for allowing me the time to bunker out of sight for long stretches of time. Writing is ultimately a solitary craft. Without your love, support, and vision, my dear, I wouldn't have been able to write a single word. So that's the acknowledgements. Gives me great pleasure to read those. So next, I'm going to start with the introduction of the book as the first reading of the evening, and then we'll do some questions and answers. But first, raise your glass to all of those in the acknowledgements. Thank you so much. All right, so now we'll do the introduction. Actually, I think I'm going to read it on my computer. It's a little easier. And we'll start with that quote that was just brought up that I suppose lacks a citation. So that'll be in the next version of the book. I'll add some more footnotes. Please feel free to point those out to me. Anything that you come across in the book that you feel is insufficiently substantiated, because that's very important to me. After this, we'll also have our guest appearance, as many of you know, from Ashley Rindsberg. But first, the introduction. We will know our disinformation campaign has been successful when everything the American people believe is false. William Casey, director of the CIA, 1981 to 1987. Virginia Roberts folded 8 white towels into stacks, ensuring the seams lined up and the spa's floral logo appeared in the corner. She placed the stacked towels on a polished granite countertop. There were no customers, so she tied her blonde hair into a ponytail and resumed reading where she had left off in an illustrated guide to massage therapy. She found the book fascinating. I'm only 15, she reminded herself, but she had a goal now: to ascend from mere attendant at the luxurious Mar-a-Lago resort to real professional massage therapist. A woman with pointy black locks of hair appeared. Virginia offered the woman tea, as she always did, and asked politely whether she had an appointment. The woman didn't have an appointment, but she accepted the tea. With a friendly smile and with a proper English accent, the woman asked Virginia several questions about the spa before she asked about her copious notes in the massage book. With a bashful smile, Virginia shared her goal. The woman told Virginia that her boss was a wealthy man, and as it turned out, he was looking for a massage therapist for his frequent jet trips around the world. He would pay for her trainings if Virginia showed the right enthusiasm for the job. The woman handed Virginia her card and introduced herself. Her name was Ghislaine Maxwell. It was June 2000, and a 3-year nightmare was about to unfold for Virginia as she followed in the path of dozens, perhaps thousands, of young girls who were abused by Jeffrey Epstein. Later that warm summer night, Virginia visited Epstein's Palm Beach mansion, as many of the unfortunate girls did before they accompanied him to Paris, New York, London, and Little St. James, Epstein's private island in the Virgin Islands. The girls were offered as sexual property, escorts and massage therapists, quote unquote, to some of the world's most powerful and wealthy men, millionaires and billionaires, former presidents and foreign royalty, senators and judges, hedge fund tycoons and Hollywood producers, powerful attorneys and famous actors, chairmen of boards and CEOs of giant conglomerates. They all flew on Epstein's plush private plane. The plane was nicknamed the Lolita Express. Ascending from a resort attendant to a professional massage therapist was not in the cards for Virginia. Shortly after that night, as she tells the story, she was forced to have sex with Prince Andrew of England, famed attorney Alan Dershowitz, and many others. Those known to have flown on Epstein's jet many times include Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Bill Gates, and countless others. No legal action was brought against Epstein for years. The first case brought against him occurred in 2005 when a different girl's mother brought charges of sexual assault on behalf of her daughter. Many other victims then came forward immediately, revealing Epstein had been running a pedophilia rape ring since at least 1993. Local law enforcement amassed a litany of evidence and multiple witnesses. It looked like a slam dunk case. Epstein faced life in prison for sex trafficking. What ensued was one of the saddest chapters in American legal and media history. The FBI stepped in and took over the case from local Florida law enforcement. The federal attorneys heard hours of damaging testimony from the victims themselves and their families, but chose to use a grand jury, which protected Epstein from the most threatening charges. Epstein's powerful attorneys, including Alan Dershowitz, who himself was a frequent traveler on the Lolita Express, secured a highly unusual non-prosecution from U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta. It was a sweetheart deal that required him to plead guilty to one charge at the state level. In exchange, Acosta granted Epstein immunity and canceled an FBI probe into his activities. How is this possible? Acosta claimed orders had, quote, come from above, unquote, that were, quote, above his pay grade, unquote. National media coverage was nowhere to be found. A New York Magazine piece, Billionaires Are Free, was one of few national pieces on Epstein at the time, but it vindicated him with a shockingly permissive attitude. Boys will be boys. And that was that. The national media uncharacteristically dropped a story about sex and famous people. Indeed, the media ran away from the matter of a major sex trafficking ring as if from an infectious virus. Epstein had to register as a sex offender following the non-prosecution. But 8 years later, he was still somehow flying on his personal jet with quote unquote very young girls to his private Caribbean island on a weekly basis. It was as if he had never been convicted at all. And the media stayed silent. Years later, after Virginia finally escaped Epstein's clutches, she married an Australian and took her husband's new name, Geoffrey. The birth of her daughter prompted her to overcome her shame and speak out. Virginia contacted national news organizations and penned a 139-page expose about her experience, which was eventually submitted as evidence against Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. In 2016, she spoke directly with ABC News host Amy Robach. Robach was intrigued, and she took up the story. She arranged a flight to New York for Virginia, and Virginia felt confident enough to tell Robach the whole horrifying story in person and on the record. Robach recorded it all and spent hours preparing a report on the bombshell revelations. The story would finally expose Epstein for what he had done. ABC News never ran the story. No corporate media channel picked it up, despite Virginia's dogged efforts. If the main priority of American news organizations is to generate clicks and views, as many Americans believe, this story was surely a godsend, but they all ignored it. Why? We will answer this question in this book. So that's the introduction. That's where and the reason I start with that particular segment, that particular idea is, well, because it's a insane and awful story, but also because it's nonpartisan. And I don't want Red, White, and Blind to be perceived as the Democrat or the Republican critique of the media. This is an issue that affects us all, the deception in the media. And so I found the Epstein story to be particularly good for that. It goes on, but I'll stop there. The next thing we're going to do is, well, I'll throw it open for a question or two, and then we're going to have our surprise guest visit. You can raise your hand and then unmute. Okay, let me see if I can. I see everybody. Damian.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I'm not sure exactly what part in the process you are, but have you kind of started the process of actually reaching out to media? And if you have, kind of what have been the responses from them?
Yeah, so I've been on a number of podcasts, and I have reached out to media. So far, I haven't had any bites on anything larger than a couple of the podcasts I was on were sort of medium-sized, but I haven't been able to get anything bigger than that. So if you know of anyone or know of anyone who knows anyone, I think the podcasts have gone very well. I think the interviews I do are quite good, and I think the topics that I bring up are quite important. But there is that sort of elephant in the room, which is that the book is heavily critiquing the corporate media. So the idea that the corporate media would put me on maybe as a reach, I don't know. We'll see. I'm very interested to see where it goes. Yeah, thanks for the question. Bet, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So is there going to be an Audible version?
Yes. So I was asked this 3 weeks ago, and I said I didn't know yet, but I've had enough inquiries about the audiobook version that I am going to do an audiobook. And the only question, yeah, and people say that they like my reading voice. Not everybody says that, but some people do. So I'm going to read it. And the only question is whether, so for Double Happiness, I don't know if you remember, but I literally spent a lot of money. I rented out this studio in Berkeley. It was really fun, but it was very expensive. And I did a great audiobook, but I think I'm going to try to do it myself this time. I have this studio. I think I can make it a little bit better even than it sounds now. And then, do it without breaking the bank. Thumbs up. All right. Yeah. Feel free. Anybody else that's interested in the audiobook. Yeah. Let me know. And I'll do that sooner than later. All right, one more question, and then we'll go into, I see a hand up, Nick did have a question at the beginning, so I'll give one other person if anybody else wants a question. Anybody who hasn't asked a question yet? All right, we will go ahead, Nick.
Briefly, in the excerpt you read, you mentioned that the line of the story that you shared wasn't found on conventional corporate media. So obviously, unless you did some direct reporting, you got it from someplace. Could you mention some of the sources that you were able to dig this stuff up, and why not, as someone else mentioned earlier, then challenge the corporate media to either debunk or acknowledge and include that stuff about these these things with Epstein.
Yeah, so I cut off the reading, like literally right the next segment I go into sort of which when Julie K. Brown finally published a piece in the Miami Herald in 2019. And that was sort of what was actually at the very end of 2018. She was sort of a low-level reporter and she was allowed to put something out. But independent media had been reporting on it a bit before that, which is something that I really talk a lot about in the book is the birth of independent media and why that's a really positive thing for stories like Epstein to come out earlier than when the government and corporate media decide that it's okay for us to hear about it. In terms of what sources I use, so by the time I'm writing my book, I started writing the book in 2019. So by that point, the Epstein stuff was pretty much all over. But to get at some of the stuff that I'm talking about, like telling the story of Virginia's story and things about Clinton and Dershowitz and Bill Gates and these different people and whether they were involved or not. I source all of that. All of that is heavily sourced in the book. It's generally from corporate media. It's generally from things like, there'll be some British tabloids, that'll put it out and then it'll be picked up by an American tabloid and then it'll end up in the Washington Post or NPR after that. But it all gets passed through these different sieves of the various types of bias. And so I think after we read after we have Ashley Rindsberg, I'll talk a little bit about these biases because the introduction of the book after I do Epstein, it goes into a lot of the terms of the book. And there's an element to which this book, if you've started reading it, is meant as, in addition to an expose, it's also a little bit of a how-to. It's a little bit of a how to parse the mainstream media that we're exposed to and independent media as well. Because the ultimate goal that I talk about, and it's on the subtitle, The Path to Media Consciousness. The path to media consciousness runs through this idea of not just reading what we're reading or viewing what we're viewing, but asking what it is they want us to think, right? Having consciousness in between our perceptions and our belief. In the same way we have consciousness between, if I get angry, and I don't know why I'm angry and I just fly into a rage versus, oh, I'm feeling angry again. I wonder if it's because, my son didn't put away his toys, right? Or something like that. Having that little moment of consciousness, right, is the path of, spiritual growth. It's the path of psychological health, right? So it's a similar thing. Media consciousness is this idea of, oh, here comes a story about, Jeffrey Epstein. What is it? Not just what does the story say, but who gets to say it? Who doesn't get to say it? What is it that they want me to think or they want me to feel about this particular story? Having that consciousness is what I call media consciousness. So we'll get into that a little bit more later on. All right, so we're now going to have let me set it up. We're going to have our guest appearance here if I can do it. Okay. And this is Ashley Rindsberg, and a brief introduction to Ashley Rindsberg. We were put in touch through the publicist I started working with, who had also represented Ashley Rindsberg. And his book, The Gray Lady Winked, came out not last year, but the year before. And it was something I was really interested in. And I saw him on a couple of media appearances. He wrote this brilliant book about the New York Times. And, I spent a good bit of Red, White, and Blind on the New York Times because it is viewed as sort of the gold standard in the US media. It has for so long. And so its errors and its deliberate misrepresentations, I think, are just ever so slightly more important than those in other sources. And so when Ashley Rindsberg wrote this book, it just blew me away. And it was very much an honor to talk to him and to have him write the foreword for Red, White, and Blind. So without further ado, Ashley Rindsberg, who isn't joining us live, I have to apologize. He read this, he's in London, and so he'll apologize for the time zone difference, but he did this yesterday, and he will be reading the foreword of the book right now, if I can get this set up.
Hey there, everybody. This is actually Rindsberg, author of The Great Lady Winked, and now the proud author of the foreword to Tony Brasunas' new book, Red, White, and Blind. I want to say thank you to Tony for asking me to write this foreword. It means a lot to me because he and I, as you might have guessed, share a mission, and that mission is probably one that you are also committed to, and that's the mission of fostering a more open, accurate, transparent, and honest media that is essential to our lives and to the democracies in which we live. So I want to say thank you to you guys because you are the ones who are helping carry this mission forward. Tony, as you probably know, has written a tremendous and very important book here, and you are the ones who are going to help bring that book into the world. So please share it, talk about it, mention YouTube, tweet it, email it, and if you do that, send me an email to ashley@midnightoilpublishers.com showing me that you shared Red, White, and Blind, and I will give you a free ebook of The Great Lady Winked to say thank you, because again, you guys are the ones who are carrying this mission, carrying the torch into the world on this very important topic of creating a healthy media, one that we all depend on. And thank you for being a part of this event today. I'm sorry that I couldn't participate live. I'm across the pond in London, but I do appreciate that Tony asked me to read the foreword, which I will now do without further ado. I hope not with further ado. So this is the foreword that I've written for Red, White, and Blind about media, as you might have guessed. It's a truism in the world of addiction therapy or therapy of any kind that the treatment process begins with an acknowledgement of the problem. Well, we have a problem, a big problem. The American media, the free press enshrined not just in our Constitution, but in the very fabric of our democracy, is in a state of crisis. What makes matters worse is that the people seemingly in the best position to address this problem refuse to recognize its existence. In fact, they openly champion the health of the system in which they are entrenched. Unfortunately for them, but fortunately for the rest of us, the intended end user of the American press, the customer that matters so much to other industries, knows better. Trust in media has never been lower. In fact, it's all but evaporated, leaving the media hanging on to its former special status by a remnant thread of credibility. And yet, media has never been more ubiquitous or more instrumental in shaping our very perception of reality. As a result, we're today experiencing a form of society-wide cognitive dissonance. We know in our gut that the narratives being advanced do not reflect our experience of the world. Yet we are told to obey the dictates of the media delivering them. Worse still, we are accused of a kind of disallegiance to state, to society, to an unarticulated religion. It's hard to pinpoint to what, for questioning these dictates at all. But as Tony Brasunas elegantly and systematically shows in the pages to come, there is a significant opportunity in this moment. It's charged with the energy required to refashion an essential institution like the press to meet the needs of a new era. First, however, we need to understand the problem in all its ugliness, messiness, and even in what you might call its glory. What you'll learn from this book is just how subtly and expertly distortion has been woven into the current incarnation of our news media. You'll see that although we've begun to have a mainstream conversation about this in recent years, the trend is one that's played out over the course of decades. In the years following the Second World War, the American state, flush with power and loaded with resources, but also burdened with the self-appointed role of maintaining global stability and ensuring American geopolitical dominance, deduced from these political premises that it had to do everything and anything it could to fulfill this crucial imperative. Of course, it would turn to one of the most vibrant, sophisticated, and exhilarating engines of influence in history, the American media, to do this. The media, perhaps sharing a belief in this imperative, didn't just comply, but became a full-fledged partner in the enterprise of American power. That was then. We are today governed by a very different set of circumstances. We need the kind of change that by definition does not flow from power, but is opposed upon it, to limit it, to invert the dynamic that to an alarming extent has resulted in the sense that we are being ruled rather than governed. Tony's book is an important one. It's a book whose lessons you will not soon forget, least of all because Tony has experienced firsthand as a journalist working for one of the brightest names in media, just how swiftly the hands of censorship can move. You'll learn about how the CIA infiltrates a possibly all too willing press, how the clock face of journalism is today turned by gears of the corporate machine, how facts get invented, how truth gets annihilated, and stories get plucked right out of thin air. All this is to say that the time to develop what Tony calls a new media consciousness is now. There is not a moment to waste. For the first time in a long time, power is in our hands. It's up to us to use it. Thank you guys again. I hope this is a message that resonates. I'm guessing it does if you're with us today on this broadcast or live stream. And again, carry the message forward. I think that that last bit that I read from the foreword is the most important part. The power is in our hands. It's up to us. And we have much more power than we really realize. So take some of that power, spread the message, use this book to do so, but not only this book, use your ideas, your creativity, and we will actually make this world a better place through a better media. Thank you.
Well, this is the book. That's Ashley Rindsberg, The Gray Lady Winked. By all means, right after you buy my book, go get his, or maybe first, however you want to do it. It's a great book. Thank you so much, Ashley. Really appreciate it. Thank you, brother. Yeah, the power is in our hands. I couldn't have said it better myself. Really honored to have his words with us tonight. So the next thing we're going to do before I do another reading is I'm going to talk a little bit about the ideas in the book that are also in the introduction. So if you've started reading the book, or if you have the copy in your hands and you want to read along, this is the sort of terms. There's this section early in the book called the terms, where if you can see it, there's these terms of the book, and there's bias, and there's filters, and propaganda, censorship, and the narrative. And these terms I sort of define. And the one that I want to spend just a few of our precious minutes on here tonight is bias, because I think it's kind of the central concept of the book is different types of bias that come into media. And we all tend to think, and I remember Nick saying early on that, there's a bias in the media because they're all commercial enterprises, and that's true to some extent. But there's many types of bias that affect or infect media coverage. So just what's useful for tonight, I'll just go over the three main ones quickly so you can get them. So there's three main kinds of bias that I identify in the book. There's innocent bias. And so innocent bias is the bias that we have just based on who we are. We all have this based on your upbringing, your background, your profession, race, class, gender, all of the things that make you who you are. That is going to bias how you cover the news. Like, you're going to see things a little bit differently if you have a different identity or a different background. But I call that innocent bias because it's not deliberate. It's not a deliberate thing. It still matters. It's important still to balance your media based on innocent bias. That's innocent bias. Then we have systemic bias. And systemic bias is the bias that comes from whatever organization you work at. So if you work at the New York Times, you're going to have a different systemic bias than if you work at Fox, and a different one if you just work on your own. In fact, if you work on your own, independent media tends not to have systemic bias. But systemic bias is very important to understand. And then nefarious bias is the third one. And nefarious bias is the bias that's like what Ashley Rindsberg was talking about when the CIA is tuning the hands of the clock a little bit differently. It's nefarious bias is deliberate infiltration and manipulation of news narratives by intelligence agencies or by government operatives. So that's nefarious bias. So you have innocent bias, systemic bias, nefarious bias, and those are important to understand. And then I want to talk about one other thing before I get into the last segment of the book that I'm going to read, most likely the last segment, because I'm going to jump quite a bit ahead of the book, ahead in the book at this point. There's after Epstein, the next story we go into is the origin of coronavirus, and I think that really shows a lot of the bias in the media, like why that story was censored for so long. And then we go on and on. We go back into Operation Mockingbird and the CIA. We go through a whole lot of things. Then we go into 2016 election and when I was censored, writing for the Huffington Post and Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. We go into all of that. But I'm going to jump way ahead and talk about sort of looking back at what we've learned in the book, because I think this will be it'll give a good sense of where the book goes. And at this point, I will have already talked a bit about the different types of bias, and I'll also have talked a bit about Operation Mockingbird. And during Operation Mockingbird, the head of the CIA at the time called the many sources in the news a Wurlitzer. He was famously called it the mighty Wurlitzer. And the reason he did that was because at the time with Operation Mockingbird, it was sort of a boast. They had placed so many different agents and they had recruited so many journalists throughout all of the mainstream media that he called the media machine the mighty Wurlitzer. And a Wurlitzer is, if you don't know, I think it's the largest musical instrument ever created. It's this huge pipe organ with these keys, and you can just play all of these sounds, right? And it was before there was recorded music was common in the United States. So a lot of these places would have these huge Wurlitzers where they could play this really interesting music. So his boast was that the media system was a mighty Wurlitzer, that he could basically push a key and play any tune he wanted. So like if he wanted, NPR to say something about Ukraine, he would push a certain key on the Wurlitzer, right? And if he wanted something else to come out of a different source, he would push that key. And so it was like basically he could play the Wurlitzer, and that was the media system. So it's famously the mighty Wurlitzer is a famous name for that system. So I'll have talked about that quite a bit. And then this reading, the other couple of things I'll have talked about is fact checking and why fact checking is a big problem and why fact checkers tend not to actually check facts. They more check narrative compliance with narratives. And also what I call astroturf independent media, because independent media is becoming such a powerful force and so many people are reading independent media. There's a problem of what I call astroturf independent media, which is news organizations that look like they're independent media, but they're actually controlled by the same forces that are controlling the corporate media. And so without further ado, I will go into that reading. Let me see if I can find it here. And if you want to follow along, this is page 254, I think, in the book. And this segment is called Shaping the Past, Controlling the Future. The pipes of the great Wurlitzer are now played by a different set of hands. Where once the agents and complicit journalists of Operation Mockingbird manually selected which of the exquisitely tuned pipes to sound, the new master musicians have arrived, the social media giants. They have at their disposal the classical musical chords of the New York Times and Washington Post, the louder notes of Fox and MSNBC, and the steady, dulcet tones of NPR. With fact checkers and AstroTurf independent media sites, together, this marvelous instrument has a range unparalleled in history with which to blast its convincing harmonies and compelling melodies. Like an opera in its complexity, the corporate media and social media giants bend and shape the day's news to build narratives. The hidden tools of nefarious bias plant and spread a poisonous story. The 5 filters of systemic bias remove conflicting perspectives. Affirmative fact-checking lends the story a veneer of objective approbation. Finally, through information laundering, additional distortion on independent-looking AstroTurf sites seals the deal. It doesn't matter if the narratives are true or not. They serve their purpose as long as necessary. When they collapse, as with Me Too, Russiagate, and the radical sexist Bernie Sanders, they're replaced seamlessly with the next narrative, which is blasted out and repeated until it is accepted. The poet Muriel Rukeyser wrote, "The universe is made of stories, not of atoms." We humans are storytelling creatures. We understand our lives through the stories we tell each other. For thousands of years prior to widespread literacy, we shared our history and cultural knowledge through spoken myths, stories, and folklore. We tend to believe what we hear if it's told in a narrative story. Societies for generations were organized around the Bible or other sacred scripture. Stories with lessons and morals. These stories mattered to us, informed us, reminded us of where we came from, why we're here, and how to live a meaningful life. I will take Rukeyser's words one step further. Our lives are made of narratives, not facts. When we absorb the narratives of the corporate media, and all of us do on some level, we tell ourselves incomplete, dishonest stories. We become confused and blinded. We forget what is most important to our own personal happiness and health and focus instead on reports, often distorted, about events that are important to those in power who control the corporate media narratives. Most of us already have our own beliefs and narratives about the trajectory of our lives, whether we believe in fate or destiny or God or a random universe. But when it comes to our role in society, in the absence of a conscious choice to tell ourselves our own narrative about what we are doing and what is worthwhile, the corporate media's narratives flood our consciousness. In the absence of alternative sources of information, we are simply overwhelmed with expertly concocted narratives that instruct us what to think, what to fear, and what to long for. This is why expanding our consciousness and reclaiming the authority to decide for ourselves what stories we believe are so important. This is the need for media consciousness. By choosing to cover one thing and not another, the corporate media organizations and those who control them get to determine what is important. This is the first step in creating a narrative, determining what is included and what is excluded. Selecting what is included isn't just the ability to decide for us what is newsworthy and what isn't. This ability also confers the power to shape and reshape the past and the future. Every narrative emphasizes what it deems to be important about the past and the future, and leaves out the rest. Narrative control also confers the power to tell us what to be outraged about, what to be satisfied with, what must be attacked, and what must be defended. We learn implicitly what isn't worth discussing such as a genocidal war in Yemen or a series of lockdown protests in Australia, and what is important, such as a scandalous speech by Donald Trump or a confirmation hearing for a cabinet position. In this way, the corporate media today distracts us more often than it informs us. The pundits and writers don't craft narratives exposing the corruption of the political parties, or the false pretenses for past wars, or the social cost of lockdowns, or government surveillance of citizens. And because of this, we don't think these things are important. In the absence of media consciousness, we don't know what is truly important on any given day. Such a confused and blind citizenry is easier to control. This is why these biases and filters exist and have existed since at least the time of Edward Bernays, as we will see in the next chapter. Were the propaganda not at work? Were the Mockingbird system not at work? Were the filters of systemic bias not at work? The media organizations would be unable to exercise this tremendous power over our society's views of the world. We would have a freer and fairer society. Humanity does not want to be at war with itself, but war is profitable and confers control of natural resources. Human beings generally do not want other human beings to be blown up, dismembered, poisoned, or sickened. But it is quite profitable to blow people up, dismember them, poison them, and sicken them. So people have to be convinced, cajoled, lied to, deceived, told that other beings deserve to be blown up or dismembered, told that drugs will heal them, and told that illness comes from bad people. It can be profitable to treat illness or bring peace, but even treatments and peace are more profitable if the people never quite get well or the war never quite ends. Peace and health are the states humanity most longs for. They are also the states that are least advantageous to the drug and weapons corporations and the financial and media corporations that serve them. Neither health nor peace confers power over others, nor concentrates wealth in the hands of the few. Through media consciousness, you will see these things, and they will enrage you. And then they will set you free. I wrote this book to show us our blindness, for I believe it is upon noticing blindness that we learn to see. We are awakening today. It's a new enlightenment, a time in which we are telling each other our own, better, truer stories. So that's that section. Thank you for listening. I think we can have some questions now. I think it's a good time for questions. So I think if you raise your hand, I can just recognize you. Lynne Michelson.
You know, I think you've got us pretty excited by your introduction. And now you've shared something of the more, we call it like didactic, like what will help us grow ourselves, you know, becoming more media conscious, not conscious, awake. And I think where I'm at is I saw this movie called She Said, which was actually very similar in certain ways, that they couldn't publish or they didn't publish the stories of the famous, is it Murdoch, I think, and all of his sexual abuse. So I find myself curious as to, I know you're going to go through the book and tell us, but why you picked that story for your first lead story and how it might, if you just gave us a little flavor of how it kind of really shows us how the media is complicit in this way. And I think what you're about to say is it was protecting certain people, but I don't know. And why, how would they defend themselves? So that's just a question I think right now that I'm going to author. How you chose it and how it weaves through. Do you feel like speaking about that?
Yeah, great question. So why I chose the Epstein story as the initial story. Yeah. So as you know, and I spent a lot of when I first wrote the book, let me start there. When I first wrote the book, I was writing the book in 2019, and I had been censored at Huffington Post for covering Bernie Sanders, that side of things. And I think you guys know that story. I could tell that story again. It's in the book. And so I had started the book with like sort of Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and writing a lot about that. But I realized as I started writing the book that I did not want this book to come across as partisan. I had sort of moved on from that, and particularly during the pandemic, I think even more so. I come from the left. I come from being a progressive. I think my values haven't changed, but I'm now feel a bit more like an orphan politically. And so my critique of the media, I now see that when I began researching the book, I was expecting to find a lot of errors and lies and you know, on the right, and that the Republicans, because that's kind of how I grew up, the Republicans were all full of lies, and the Democrats and the New York Times were mostly true. And instead, I found it's almost equal. I mean, to try to sort it out, there's so much on both sides, and there's lots of truth on both sides, but it's all sort of propaganda woven into deception, that I really wanted the book to come across not as the Democrat or the Republican critique of the media. And so the Epstein story seemed like a really good first one to take on, because I don't think there's anybody out there, even if you're just the most diehard Republican or diehard Democrat or independent, who's like, oh yeah, there's nothing wrong with the Epstein story. It's totally fine that at the apex of Western power, there was a pedophilia ring run, you know, for over 2 decades, you know, and he got away with it basically until he didn't, but I mean, for 25 years. So I chose that because I thought it was a really good way to demonstrate, you know, look at how this was quashed. And then, you know, when the Amy Robach part came out of it, where Amy Robach, like Virginia Giuffre had went to Amy Robach and had actually flown to New York and told her the whole story. Amy Robach had written it, and then ABC News killed the story. It's just too perfect of an example of, so why are they hiding this guy? And then why are they protecting him? And then, well, it turns out, you know, Epstein comes out and he says, well, I've got blackmail on all these people. And then finally, you know, Ghislaine Maxwell goes on trial and she's convicted, but still to this day, there's never been a day in court where the actual perpetrators, like when do you have a crime where the actual perpetrators are never talked about? We talk about Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, but what about all of the very powerful men that took part in all of this? And we know some of them, like I mentioned, Bill Gates was there a lot, and Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, although Donald Trump sort of broke with Epstein in like the early 2000s. So I guess it's a long way of answering your question. I chose it not because it's a story that I'm like so interested in, but because I think it's a really good story to sort of open the book as like, look, this is not something that is just for Democrats or Republicans to hate the other side and think the other side is the problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Looks like we've got Bob Michelson. Go ahead.
Up here. There we go. Turn that off first. So here's a question for you. Was it intentional that this great book unveiling started at the exact moment as a State of the Union started? Come on, let's hear the truth here.
Great question. No, and I just noticed that like 2 days ago. I was like, oh, the State of the Union. I really didn't. I chose a Tuesday night because the in-person event was on a Tuesday, and it just seemed to work really well for people's schedules. For some reason, like Tuesday is a good literary night. Maybe people want to go out later in the week. I did not choose it for the State of the Union. So to all of you that are here instead of at the State of the Union, then it means that much more to me. And maybe I can do my best State of the Media account here.
Okay, by the way, that question came from Loree, not from me, so she gets credit.
I don't want credit. I wasn't going to ask it.
We were speculating here.
Loree gets credit for the question. Bob gets credit for actually asking it. How about that? It looks like we've got Jim Brasunas, unless I think Jim already asked a question. Anybody else? Gonna try to spread it around. Jim Brasunas, you're on. It's my father.
Yeah, thanks for allowing me to have a second calling on. So my question is, based on everything, do you think that it's possible? And I think, you know, as a culture, as people, as individuals, we try to get to an unbiased understanding of things. But is that really possible? I mean, is it possible for somebody to truly be unbiased? Or is it the fact that we all have biases, whether we see them or not? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. No, we're all biased. We all have bias. And that's what I call innocent bias, right? So there's three kinds of bias. There's innocent bias is absolutely like, I have a particular bias because I, you know, had hippie parents and grew up on a hippie commune. Then I went to Amherst College. Then I lived in China. Then I lived in San Francisco and had a bunch of fun with some guys like Daimian. And, you know, I have my own biases that I have based on who I am and, you know, all of the good and bad things that have happened to me in my life, et cetera, et cetera. So that's important to know. And so when we get into the balanced media diet, which I really propose as a major part of getting to media consciousness is balancing our media diet, is that you balance it across these different biases. So innocent bias is important to balance from. You don't want all your media news reporting to come from people that have essentially the same background. And we do have that problem in sort of the like, I would say it's more of a problem on the sort of liberal Democrat side, where you have a lot of the people that work at like New York Times and NPR have a lot of overlapping background. Now that's not as big of a problem as if it was like every single report came from Tony Brasunas. Like you wouldn't want just my perspective all the time. So some balance helps. But it's really important to realize that innocent bias is not the same as systemic bias and nefarious bias. So to say that everybody's biased, and so then I'll just go to whoever I want, that's not the same as what I propose with media consciousness, is you notice that systemic bias is different, right? So if you have a number of people all working at the same news corporation, which is owned by a parent corporation, which is owned by another parent corporation, right? And there's only 5 of them controlling basically all of the media that money can buy in the United States, they're going to have a particular bias. Even if their innocent bias is different, they're going to have this intense bias not to, and there's 5 filters that I won't get into, but I distinguish 5 filters of systemic bias. Basically, it's like, you can't say things that their advertisers don't like. You can't say things that are going to get that particular publication into you know, people boycotting them. You can't jeopardize their connection to elite sources, because elite sources is how they, you know, make their money. All of these kinds of things, that's systemic bias, right? And you can't avoid systemic bias in independent media. Independent media, if it's just me with my YouTube channel, I have my innocent bias for sure. It's Tony Brasunas, my own stuff, but I don't have systemic bias. It's just me with my YouTube thing. There's nobody telling me I can or can't do something, or that, you know, I'm going to be fired or I'm going to be promoted, depending on how I cover the news. You know, and at these publications, people are smart. They notice that if, okay, like Joe Schmo, he wrote about this particular piece with this, you know, opinion, and he left these things out and he got promoted. Jane Schmo, she wrote it a little bit differently and she did these things and she didn't get promoted. In fact, she was let go at the next layoffs. People notice that and they do the things that get them promoted, right? So that's systemic bias. Finally, just to reiterate all the biases, nefarious bias is also different, right? So nefarious bias is actual manipulation of the narratives by intelligence. And this is happening a lot. This is just off the charts. This is happening all the time, more than we think. Now, is it bigger deal than systemic bias? Maybe not, but it's a really big part of it. So it's a long answer to your question, but yeah, we do have biases, but innocent bias is not the same as systemic and nefarious bias. And so when you create your balanced media diet, I really recommend you keep the systemic bias and the nefarious bias to less than half of your diet, maybe a third, and a lot more independent media, a lot more. Have your innocent bias that, you know, okay, this person has this bias, but then you know that's their bias. versus you just turn on NPR and you don't know, you just know that you're getting the bias of NPR. All right, we've got Ben and Dmitry. Dmitry, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, Tony. Dmitry here. Dmitry Drozdov. I got to know you during 2016 Bernie stuff, and you actually sent me your book, and I didn't read it. Being honest here, but I'm gonna read it. So, question here is, you're preaching to the choir here, okay? You probably realize, okay, we all understand that media is biased, and that's why we're, that's why we're in our circle, right? And so, but we know people who don't realize that they believe the media. I don't know, you want to call them brainwashed or whatever. Yeah. And so I'm thinking, I'm gonna get this book. I'm gonna get it, so I know what's in there. Although, I'm gonna agree with everything that's there. There's no question about that. So I want to use your book as a tool, maybe to open somebody's eye. And so I'm thinking, for example, I have a neighbor who really is big into liberal media. He claims that he's not even a Democrat, blah, 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 whatever. But I'm thinking, how would I just bring my book, your book, to him and say, you can have it for a week, take a look at it, see if you want to read it, because if you're going to start reading it, you're going to, you're going to realize how it works, if you pay attention. So do you have any suggestion on, is that a good way, or how would you approach somebody like that?
Great question, Dmitry, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I don't remember meeting you during the Bernie times, but I'm sure that I did, and it's an honor.
Meeting on Facebook, not.
Okay. Okay. Well, so I'll answer in two parts. So the first one is that I'm preaching to the choir, and that you're going to agree with everything in my book. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that I'm preaching to the choir, and I don't know that everybody is going to. I think most people actually will find something in the book that may be jarring. In fact, I write in the introduction that if you have a particular strong belief in the media sources that you follow being accurate, you might find the book. You might find yourself in for a bit of a, you might find the book a struggle because I take on all the different sources and I look at all of them. So I have a feeling that many people will find some issues with my book, but yeah, it's possible. I think that I'm right about everything. So you might think that I'm right about everything as well. But we tend to like have there tend to be natural disagreements. It's just sort of part of human nature. But I would love to hear your thoughts as you go through it. So please share them. In terms of your bigger question, like how do we confront or how do we talk to someone? How do we share this with others? And what I've found is the best way is to just be open and to talk to people and to listen. If people are in a place where they are, very heavily believing that their one source is totally true, and because what we've gotten to in this country there's definitely a large number of people that believe not only that their source is right, but that the people on the other side are wrong and bad and evil, and they need to be censored or shunned. And I really reserve the strongest language in my book for free speech and for opposing censorship, because I think censorship is the height of arrogance, to think that there's nothing further to learn. We're at the end of science and democracy, and we know this person needs to be shut up. I think it's outrageous and arrogant. So I would never advocate for that. But in terms of if this person that your neighbor, yeah, I mean, have conversations with them and say, just open the conversation, listen. And I'd be honored if you found my book to be useful to them. Share the book and say, hey, this is a friend of mine wrote this book. He spent a lot of time, researching and writing this book. And I think it's something that you would enjoy. I'd be honored.
Yeah, I mean, look, what I meant you're preaching to the choir is that, I mean, I literally don't have any publication that I think doesn't have systemic bias as you explained now. Okay, so I treat them all as having systemic bias. So when I read it, I know that NPR has that kind of bias, which I think is the worst. NPR is the most crafty out of them. That's my personal bias. And so I don't, but this person actually thinks that the media, you know, the stories do get vetted and they're correct and they're telling the truth. And so he bought into it, okay? So at least for him to realize, you know, to read about this systemic bias, nefarious bias type of stuff, I think it would at least halfway open anybody's eyes if they just read it, because it does make sense. You know, you cannot argue. Okay, so I'll see how it goes. I'll give you feedback. If somebody gets converted or enlightened, that would be great.
And this, Dmitry, thank you so much. And this actually gets back a little bit to Lynne's question, which is why I started with the Epstein story, you know, and just start with that and be like, so what did you think happened with Jeffrey Epstein? And just see if that starts a conversation, you know. But anyway, let's move on. I really appreciate Dmitry. I want to get to some of the other questions. Thank you, man. And I think I would be remiss. I remember getting, you know, finishing my amazing event in person, and then I totally forgot to ask people to actually like sign up for my newsletters and all that stuff. So I should take a moment. If you scroll all the way to the top of the chat, I put there the way you can actually get the book. I would love for you to get the book. If you don't feel ready to get the book, there's a free excerpt. You can just go to redwhiteandblind.com and get a free excerpt. You just have to subscribe, and then it shows up in your inbox, and then you can unsubscribe if you don't want to ever get any emails from me. And then I have a free subscription to my newsletter and a free subscription to my video. There's also a link to the ebook. So I think let's just, I want to just take 1 minute where we don't talk and everybody just go do something, you know, buy the book if you haven't yet, sign up for newsletter if you haven't, or just, you know, go to the bathroom if you don't want to do any of those things. All right, well, that was timely. My internet just went down. I don't know how that happened. Yeah, it's working. Thank you. So that was, I guess, well timed. All right, hopefully everybody had a moment to go do something helpful. Oh no, did the chat? So I just went off the Zoom. Is the chat still there? Do you still have all the links in the chat? Somebody, no, it's gone. All right, let me go get them. And then I'll come back and whoever's got their hand raised will get the next question, but I want to see what happened here. Okay, I just posted everything in the chat again. All right, I don't know how many snafus that was, but I think we're back in business. It looks like we've got Ben. You want to ask a question?
Yes. Let me just turn on my video. Okay. So Tony, I have a question for you first before I express an opinion. And that is, which bias do you think is has the most preponderance or the most widespread influence?
You mean between innocent, nefarious, and systemic, or do you mean like a specific kind of bias? Or do
No,
you
I mean between those three.
That's a tough one. I haven't thought about that. Which one is actually more? I mean,
Well,
innocent bias is so pervasive because we all have it. So I think it's probably the most pervasive, but I don't think it's the most damaging. I think the most damaging is probably nefarious bias because it's the hardest one to figure out, and it's the one that, you know, is most easily sort of hidden. I mean, we know about Operation Mockingbird because of the Church Committee, which came out in the early 1970s. And that happened because there was such a huge outcry about the Kennedy assassination, the other assassinations, and Vietnam, and all the stuff that was going on then. That led to an actual congressional hearing about the CIA. We haven't had anything like that since. That was the most profound revelation. We learned about Operation MK Ultra, which was mind control, that the CIA was doing. We learned about, so many things in that Church Committee, and we haven't had one since. And so I do a big part of my book, which is like, I lay out Operation Mockingbird. That's now declassified. We know that happened. They recruited hundreds and hundreds of the most famous journalists, and they placed journalists in the media and all that stuff. That happened for sure. But then, George H.W. Bush took over the CIA in the early 80s, and he said, we're not going to do that anymore. There's a memo. We're stopping with this. But even within the memo, there's these loopholes where he's like, we're not going to do any more paid collaboration with journalists, but we would welcome unpaid collaboration. He offers all these like little loopholes. But so still there's this sense that like, oh, Operation Mockingbird was done. It ended in the 1970s or it ended in the 1980s. And so I spent a bit of my book looking at like why that's certainly not the case. There's so much evidence and so many instances of why that's happened. But it's still difficult, and people don't necessarily know it, and I don't know it. I know what I've researched, how much is being manipulated by nefarious bias. So I'd say that's the most damaging. I think innocent bias is the most pervasive. And then systemic bias is sort of right in the middle. It's also very damaging, and very pervasive. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, that wasn't all really. I wanted to go a bit further. Because it seems to me that systemic bias is the most widespread in terms of our present media. But I may be off a bit. But in terms of innocent bias, that's very interesting. And what you say, I think, is true. And I think your dad was pointing to something with this question. In terms of our naivety. And I mean, I'm really aware of where you grew up because I was there and I was a part of it. And things that all of us are to some degree or another involved with in terms of studying or trying to grow or evolve consciousness really has a deeper, more widespread effect on all of this than any of us even suspect, because there's a dark well in each of us with shadows that we either are not aware, or if we are aware, we don't realize how much that influences our everyday perspectives in life. And if we do not expose those shadows within ourselves and explore them, then that puts glasses over our eyes, it seems to me. And that is a huge factor. And by the way, I wanted to say, I really appreciate your book. And I really enjoyed the book coming out party because
thanks, Ben. Ben, I'm going to get on to another question, if that's okay, or did you have another question? Because we had a couple other hands raised.
No, I was just going to ask what people think of the influence of unconsciousness in regards to all of this. That's all.
Well, so yeah, I'll answer that quickly. I mean, consciousness is in the subtitle of the book, right? So the truth about disinformation, the path to media consciousness. I think consciousness is the underlying goal here. In a sense, the whole book is about maybe the first half or first 2/3 is sort of laying out the problem, like how Ashley Rindsberg says we have a problem, just displaying all of the different ways that both sides, all sides of the media are deceptive, laying out the problem. Then the last third of the book is why I'm optimistic about the future and why I think we are moving towards media consciousness and the unfolding of independent media that's raising a huge hue and cry in the establishment corporate media because they know they're losing their power. But I think we are moving inexorably towards this place of media consciousness and towards this opening that I call the new enlightenment. I think we're moving into a phase like when the movable type printing press was invented in the 1400s, when we went from a top-down distribution of information where the feudal system and the Catholic Church basically controlled all distribution of information. And if you said the sun was the center of the galaxy, you were a conspiracy theorist and a blasphemer, and you were going to be, put on the rack or whatever happens to conspiracy theorists these days. But the power of the movable type printing press triumphed over all of that. And it led to the Renaissance and the Reformation. It led to the Enlightenment, and it led to the United States Constitution, the French Revolution, all of that. And I think we're in a similar phase. I think the internet is as powerful, if not more powerful, in transforming our consciousness now. And we're just at the very beginning of it. I think we're in the second inning of a 9-inning game. And the internet is just starting to show us how connected and how conscious we can become. I have a lot more to say on that, but let's get to another question. I see Mermaid of Atlantis, Pamela has her hand up. And really quickly, thank you, Dan, for your comment. If you don't know how to raise your hand, there's a comment in the text. There's a reaction button in the Zoom options, and one of them is just raise your hand. So that's how to do it. So go ahead, Pamela.
Okay, hi. Ben, I really liked what you just said about the naivete, and it was good to see you at the live event, just FYI, good to see you. Couple things that have come up. So when you talk about systemic bias, I just really want to, so there's kind of like, my own awakenings throughout my life, and then sort of even with the media piece. But the one part I wanted to highlight, because Tony's been in a very interesting position, right? He has shared his views, he's shared his truth, and we have been privy to a lot of people reaching out to Tony to say, XYZ, what do I do about this? How do I move forward? So I just want you to know that the systemic bias, sadly, is not only within our journalists' reality, right? Oh, am I getting promoted? Am I getting demoted? Do I get to run my story? Do I not? Unfortunately, it's in our higher education system, where we have PhDs trying to decide if they give the science or if they're just quiet because they want the promotion. We have people who have mentors that they believe what they have learned from their teachers over years, who just now have to make a choice. Oh gosh, do I say this on social media? Do I say nothing? And so it's a big thing, right? When people are feeling silenced, just to be able to share what they might think or believe, or how their own systemic institution is having an influence on whether they feel they can speak up or not. So I just want to put that out there. The other thing that's been interesting, my wake up really happened in 2016, right, when Tony was at the Democratic National Convention and had a firsthand understanding of what was going on with anybody that had a Bernie sign versus anyone that had a Hillary sign. Okay, that's a whole nother interesting thing. But I just wanted to plug in there, like, how fun, Tony. We had so much fun in 2016 when we were like dancing on the streets of Berkeley with all those people who were like Bernie supporters. And I just wanted to put it out there that, like, one of the things that was very disappointing about the era was like the Bernie bros, when we were actually dancing on the street with a complete diverse group of people, all ages, all diversities, and like, it was so sad that like that was only really captured if you were watching or part of alternative media. And so those were the things that kind of happened for me as Tony's partner. That the wake up, it's like, it'll probably hit us all at different times, but for me it's pretty obvious in 2016. It was pretty obvious in 2016. And then just I have a prayer and a wish and a blessing for all of those who are in conflict of whether to speak up or not, because there are many of them. And I am a little bit worried about our public institutions that are supported by big money as well.
Yeah, thanks, sweetheart. I just to sort of put a point on what you said about the Bernie bros, that's a perfect example of a media narrative that was manufactured, and I document that one in the book very closely. How it came out, there's an article in the Atlantic, and then that was picked up by the New York Times, and it became this whole thing that there were these Bernie bros that were like supposedly toxic on social media and were like too aggressive. It was this whole made up thing, and there was no evidence for it. I mean, there are toxic people. There's always a tiny percentage of fans of any sports team or politician or anything that are toxic to other people, but that's usually more about those people's issues, not the particular candidate. But yeah, that was used, absolutely, and it was a good insight into how a narrative is constructed. Yeah, you were a Bernie bro too. Yeah, it was a really interesting time where there were these hashtags, Bernie made me male and Bernie made me white, where like people of color and women would say, how am I supposedly a white dude that just because I support Bernie? It's a really interesting time. Thanks so much for saying that. Let's take one or two more questions, then I'm going to have some closing comments. Dan, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I wanted to ask about a big theme of your book is that we should listen more to independent media. And currently there's this huge wave of really popular content creators, led, I think, by Joe Rogan, who have just amassed huge platforms. And these guys have a lot of innocent bias, no doubt. But it seems like because they're independent, they're less on the rating of systemic bias and nefarious bias. I mean, if you told me that Joe Rogan has got some really nefarious political agenda going, I'm not sure I would believe that. So what I want to ask is, can we achieve a better world? Can we improve our media consciousness by avoiding the New York Times, avoiding the corporate media, and just listening to independent content creators?
Great question, Dan. I really like that. Yeah, and it's true, right? We're seeing independent creators like Joe Rogan's a perfect example. He's probably got the biggest podcast in the world, and there's dozens of those. And I highlight a lot of them in the book, and I put a lot of them in the balanced media diet that I recommend. But can we like, is it time to just stop reading the New York Times and the Washington Post and stop watching Fox and turn off NPR and CNN and all of it? And I say no, with a caveat. I think I still put corporate media in the balanced diet for a couple of reasons. The first reason is because the goal is media consciousness, right? And the tool is the balanced media diet. And if we're going to learn how to become media conscious, we have to still be aware. We have to still see those narratives. That's how we learn to decipher the truth, right? Is if you like listen to Joe Rogan, and it's, again, not that Joe Rogan's always truthful, but it's true. He doesn't have systemic or nefarious bias. So there's just the innocent bias. If we listen to that, and then we listen to somebody maybe a slightly different set of innocent biases, and then we go and look at the corporate media, that's the path. That's what I recommend. And that's what I try to do myself, is then that's how you learn to decipher it. That's how you learn to see, okay, this is what's coming out of the corporate media that's truthful and that's helpful, and this is what's not, right? So that's the first reason to do it, is because it's important. The second reason is because the corporate media is still very powerful, right? It's not gone. It's not going to be gone for a long time. I would say it is going in its death throes now, but it's going to be kicking and coughing around for a long, long time. And the bias that comes out of it still affects us, and it affects our friends and our family and, people at work. And so it's still important to know what it's saying, to be aware of it. And so what I put in the balanced media diet is like, think of it as like, I don't know if the analogy is perfect, but like junk food or something, right? Or like dessert, but it's not dessert, but it's something that's part of your diet, but it shouldn't be the staple, right? It should be part of the diet that's there, because it's important still, A, to be aware of it, and B, to use it as how you are developing media consciousness. Yeah. So I still recommend it. Let's do one more question, and then if there's any questions, and then I'll have some closing remarks, unless there's anything else anybody wants to bring up. Who wants to ask the last question? We've got a Nick Lento. Anybody? Nick did ask a question. Is there anybody that hasn't asked at all? I know there's a lot of people here that have been silent. Bob, what are you doing? You're pointing to Loree. Loree, do you want to raise your hand? You just have to click the little hand raise thing, and then I can unmute you. Here, Nick, I'll come to you. I'm not going to cut you off, but I'm going to have Loree go. Well, Loree, you got to do it. I'm not going to let Bob raise your hand for you. You think about it, and we'll have Nick ask his question. All right, Loree, you think about it. I'll come to you next. All right, Nick.
First, again, I want to thank you. I look forward to reading the book even more now, having been with you all for about an hour and a half. And I think that your book really should be part of a media literacy course that's offered in higher aspects of high school and college level. And what you've said, the insights that you've shared so far, I think there's room for dozens, if not hundreds, of books like yours, because this is such a large subject. And I want to get back to a comment or a question that Jim, your dad, asked. This idea of the implicit things is, what does it mean for humans, for us to be able to be objective, and free of bias? And what comes to me, and what I'd like to put to you as a question, would that not be the idea or the concept of what our aim is? Like, what is it? Where do we want to end up as individuals, as a species, as a nation? And if one takes that as the touchstone of what truth is and what's important, then the kind of stuff that you're talking about, media as means of communicating and influencing each other, etc., isn't just coming from wanting to be popular or rich or powerful, etc., but rather from wanting to achieve certain aims, like not becoming extinct, like evolving. So that, and I will stop there because now I can go on and on. I don't want to do that. but I think you've got the gist of where I'm coming from. I'd like to hear your take on that, if that means anything to you.
Well, I think what you're asking is like, what's the greater aim? And I'm going to kind of get at that in my closing remarks. Yes, because I think there is an ultimate question of like, what is it all for? Why even become conscious, right? Why even become conscious? If I'm getting we'll take a step back in a minute. Let me get one last question. This is Loree's last chance. And I don't see a hand up. It's your chance. We will go to Mendoza. Go ahead.
Am I on?
You're on.
Oh my goodness. Okay. This seems like a very simple-minded question to me when I think about it. But I would like to know, Tony, how do you discern the truth, even if you've read independent media, corporate media, all the views that you can put your hands on? Is there really a point where you find truth? I feel like there's so many conflicting messages that it's hard to discern. Have you found you've truly been able to discern by having a really wide media diet? Have you been able to discern the truth for yourself? I just don't feel like I'm up to it sometimes. You know what I mean? It's like there's just so much information out there. Any suggestions?
Yes. So great question. I wish I could say, that I found the truth or I found one source. My book would have been really short. Here's the source. It always tells the truth. Buy my book. It's one sentence long. No, and that's because everybody has innocent bias, and the bigger the source, the more systemic bias, and eventually there's nefarious bias. That's what's going on. And there is truth. Okay, so if we get into the philosophical route, I do believe in objective truth. There is truth that exists. You can't fit the ocean in a teaspoon, all these kinds of things, right? But in terms of, how have I found the truth? What I find is not necessarily the truth. I come up, I think we all do this. It's sort of the scientific method. It's sort of how our brain works if we're in relatively healthy ability to perceive. Here's some of what I'm observing. Maybe I'm reading it in the media, or maybe I'm observing it in my life. And then you come up with a theory about it, like, okay, I think this is what's going on. And then hopefully the balanced media diet helps you to stay open-minded so that you don't get into an echo chamber. And then if it continues to seem like this is the truth, then you accept it as truth. So I don't know, an example might be weapons of mass destruction in Iraq or something. I mean, that's going back a long ways, but I talk about that in the second chapter of the book. It wasn't, maybe it wasn't true. We didn't know it was true for many years, but there was this sense of like, okay, there's no evidence of this. The media is telling us that he probably, Saddam Hussein has these weapons of mass destruction. It's a threat to the world we have to invade right now. But at the time, I was, balancing my media diet. I was really new to this, but I was like, not really sure this is true. And there were people talking about that. And so I kind of came to that's what I think is the truth, is that there isn't actually weapons of mass destruction, but I wasn't certain about it for a while. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm not proposing with the balanced media diet and media consciousness that you get the truth every day, that you go to bed every night and you know the truth about every story. I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's going to happen. But what can happen is we live our lives in a way that is less deceived. That's really the goal, to live our lives in a way that is more healthy and less deceived. As we go through our lives making these big decisions, right? We all make a decision to what career to pursue, where to live, whether to travel, whether to get married, whether to have a baby, whether to take a vaccine, whether to, get an abortion. I mean, these controversial things, but like all of these decisions we make as we go through our life, they're big, important decisions, what you're going to do with your life, whether you're going to have a child. And if we make these decisions in a place where we're less deceived, I think we live a healthier life. So this is even tying back into Nick's question a little bit, right? Which is, we don't necessarily have to get to the objective capital T truth every day to live a life that is less deceived, to live a life that is more conscious. And that's really what I'm hoping to develop myself and to share with Red, White, and Blind.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So on that note, oh, Loree's hand is up. Okay, you got the honor of our last question of the night. Last question for Loree Michelson.
I wasn't actually aiming to have the last question, and I'm not sure it's right to, because I think that previous question was outstanding. As were many good questions tonight, but I can't help but feel that, and I haven't read the book, so maybe all questions will be answered then, but it feels a lot, what I've heard tonight is, it's echoing of, there are very fine people on both sides, and I'm kind of dug into a lot of the corporate media that you are kind of shitting all over a little bit. And I can't help but feel that I'm not disagreeing that there are problems, and that I'm not necessarily getting the truth in my current diet. But I think that omitting stories is very different than bringing forth stories that are absolutely untruths. And I do feel like the New York Times is really different than Fox News. I think that there's a much more deliberate effort in trying to get at the real story versus stuff that's just spewing hate and problems. But okay, take that out of it. I also I'm not convinced that systemic bias doesn't exist in independent media. Are you going to say Alex Jones or even Joe Rogan? I just don't buy it. That they are more innocent because they're independent. That's a question.
No, it's a good question. Thanks, Loree. It is a good question. I think it's a great closing question too. So first I would say I'm not necessarily shitting on corporate media, although I certainly think that there's a huge amount of deception there, and I think it's important that we wake up and see that. All sources have their biases. So I would point at the Jeffrey Epstein story that I started with, right? So that's corporate media at its best, ignoring and hiding really the worst thing. One of the worst things you can do as a human being. I mean, abducting children and right. Then there's basically forbidding anybody from asking where the coronavirus came from for 2 years. The New York Times has still not run a neutral story on the origin of the virus, even though it's 99% likely it came out of the lab at this point. They still don't do that. So what I would ask you is, do you listen to Joe Rogan? Do you watch Fox News? Because I hear what you're saying, that you feel fairly certain that your sources are better on some level, than those. I'm just going to ask you that question, how much time of the week do you spend on New York Times versus, and I'm not saying it has to be equal. I'm just curious.
No, not even remotely equal, for sure. It's I'll try, and I can't stomach Fox News for more than 5 minutes. You are 100% right. I don't not try, but I don't try very hard.
So, because what I found, and I'll just tell you my personal story. I mean, I came to this book expecting maybe to find what you would expect to find, which is that, there's a vastly more deception on the right-leaning media. That was what I was expecting to find. That was the bias I brought to this project. And instead, what I found was a lot of deception and bias on both sides. And I stand here today telling you, I don't think that the New York Times is more truthful than Fox News. I know that's probably hard to hear. They have their biases. They have very strong biases. They want to divide their people. I have a chapter 7 in the book. As I literally look at the New York Times, what they've done. I look at Fox News, read that section. Their job is to polarize people. And I subscribe to the New York Times. I read the New York Times probably 3-4 times a week. And every time there's a story that's negative about Trump, pretty much every day. Even now, he's not in the White House. There's a story that's, negative about Putin and Russia. It's very predictable, and same as Fox. It's very predictable there as well. But like, I wrote this book, and I think, somebody like you that's very intelligent, that certainly can handle, dipping your toe a little deeper into somewhere else and thinking about it. You have a strong mind. You'll be safe. You can certainly run back to safety at the New York Times if you need to. I think you'll be surprised, and I think it might be a really interesting experience. So I recommend it.
Well, I thank you for the topic. I think it's been a great night of conversation, and I wish this could sort of go on. Like, I wish we had a family reunion coming right up so we could really deep into it. Thank you. Here,
Likewise. All right, well, I am going to, I also could go on forever. These topics are near and dear to my heart. I obviously spent 3 years researching them. But I think let's wrap it there. It's been, some of you have been on for over 2 hours. So I know Zoom can get to be a little bit exhausting. So I'm gonna just wrap it here. I'm gonna offer a few of my closing comments. Oh, I would be remiss if I again didn't say, please sign up for things, go do all the things. Sign up for my newsletter, get the book if you haven't there, it's in the chat again. Okay, got to do that. Literally, I had this amazing in-person event in Petaluma, 60 people. I didn't even have a sign-up list. Everybody left and I didn't even get their email addresses, which is so funny. It's not my strong suit. I got to work on that. All right, so thank you so much for being here. It's been a delight. Maybe we will have another event like this. I love to hear where people are in the story. We had somebody saying I'm preaching to the choir, somebody saying I'm shitting on everybody, and everything in between. We're all in our different place. And I think that's part of the beauty of this. And part of the beauty, I think, of a balanced media diet is that we all come from a different place, and that's okay. That's natural. That's normal. It's normal that we have our different viewpoints. I had to sit with myself coming to this event and launching this book, and to get to Nick's question, like, why? What really is the why for me? Like, why am I doing this? And I really sat with it for a while, and I realized that there's 4 things that I came to. It wasn't just one, and I want to share them with you so that you know where I'm coming from, so that if you read this book, this is why Tony did this. And the first reason is I want to personally awaken from deception that I have. So there's an element that it's a personal journey for me to see where I have blind spots. The second is to, if in any way I can contribute to others awakening from deception or seeing blind spots that they have. I wrote this book hopefully in a way that's accessible to as many people as possible. And so, yes, was it Dmitry or whoever said, share it with others? I wrote it so it can be accessible to as many people as possible. The third reason I wrote it is because I want people to know that they're not alone if they see the corporate media narratives and they don't sit well with them. They know that it's not true on some level. I don't know if Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, or we just went through this pandemic. And I would say so many of the narratives that came out in 2020 were backpedaled in 2021. And now many of them we know are largely false in 2022. And there were a lot of people in that era. I was one of them, as you know, if you had my email, that was saying, I don't think that this particular narrative is true. And so I wrote this book also, this is reason number 3, so that people don't feel alone. You don't feel alone. The corporate media narratives can be so overwhelming. It can feel, and I've had many people tell me this since I've talked about my book, saying, I don't feel comfortable. I can say what I really think. I don't actually think this particular narrative is true, but I'm going to lose my friends, or I'm going to lose my job, or I'm going to lose my marriage if I speak truthfully what I actually feel about this. And so I want to make sure people feel, to whatever extent I can do, which is I'm just one person, don't feel alone if they see that there's deception or that they see that these particular narratives don't work for them. Your mind is important. Your dissent is important. Democracy and science only survive. They only exist where there's dissent. If we have censorship, we can't have democracy or science. They don't work. Everyone's voice is important. Your voice is important. And then the fourth and final reason for this is, and this was maybe the deepest one for me, is that I want to contribute to a future in which those feelings of being alone, the feelings of isolation, the feelings of censorship that I went through. I was censored at Huffington Post. I lost some friends over some of my emails that I wrote when I was like, I don't think this vaccine is going to stop the spread of the virus. Everybody thought I was crazy. But I was reading the science. I might have been wrong, but that was just how I saw it at the time. And certain things that I said about lockdowns and things like that, I lost some friends. I don't want anybody else to have that experience. I want us to create a future in which all voices are more broadly heard, not less broadly, where there's less censorship, whereas social media grows, it serves all of us. So we can continue to broaden our democracy, broaden our advancements in science. Innovation always happens at the edges. The people in power don't want change. They don't want a new invention because it might disrupt their power, right? So you always have to allow the edges to even if like somebody mentioned Alex Jones. I don't think Alex Jones is true. His words are truthful, but you have to allow the edges to speak so that then you can basically, you have to be able to interact with ideas that are unfamiliar, ideas that are even distasteful to you. That's how we move forward with science and democracy. And I would say a liberal society, like to use the old-fashioned sense, an open liberal society in which all people are free to follow and to pursue their own happiness and dreams. So if I can be a part of creating that future, that's the fourth reason that I wrote this book. That's what I've got, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I just love you right now. I just feel so grateful that you're all here. So anything you want to reach out to me for anytime, go to redwhiteandblind.com. I'm putting everything up there now, my newsletter, my video channel. If any of it's useful, please subscribe. If not, then, or either way, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much. Let's have one final toast. If you've got a beverage, if you don't have a beverage, you can just raise a fist. And just thank you to all of you. Appreciation to yourselves for taking time out of your busy night to think about media, think about deception, think about awakening, think about a new enlightenment. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you, Tony. Here.